The air over Kassel in October 1943 was not air at all. It was a churning, suffocating chaos of spent brass, ruptured aluminum, and frozen despair. That day, known ominously among the veteran crews simply as Black Tuesday, Major Cliff Tex Williams, flying wing on a flying fortress named the Iron Will Dash, watched the unthinkable happen, not once, but 5 times within a single, horrifying minute. The strategic doctrine held sacred by 8th Air Force Command, that massive, tightly packed formations of B-17s could defend themselves with interlocking fields of fire, was disintegrating into a bloody, terrifying myth right before his eyes. The German twin-engined heavy fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf-110s, equipped with terrifying 20mm cannons and occasionally rockets, were executing head-on passes with impunity, tearing open the fortress formations like paper dolls, and worse, they were doing it after the short-legged P-47 Thunderbolts had been forced to turn back for lack of fuel. The sight of a B-17 named Sweet 16 taking a concentrated volley directly into the nose was etched into Tex's memory, a flash of red and silver followed by a silent, immediate explosion as the pilot's cockpit and bombardier station vaporized, sending the rest of the plane spinning into an uncontrollable flat spin, shedding men and equipment across the hostile German landscape hundreds of feet below. This was the moment the U.S. Army Air Forces realized that their approach to strategic bombing was functionally suicidal, a massive drain on men and material that, if continued, threatened to bankrupt the entire European effort. For every ton of bombs dropped successfully on Nazi targets, the cost in crewmen missing in action was astronomical, often exceeding 10% losses on the deepest penetration rates like Schweinfurt. The root of the problem was brutally simple physics. The German defenders had home field advantage, superior speed once they jettisoned their auxiliary tanks, and critically, they knew exactly when the American escorts had to abandon their posts. The bomber crews knew the feeling of being naked and alone. The moment the distant rumble of the Thunderbolts faded, replaced by the ominous, organized attacks of the Luftwaffe. This wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a strategic crisis. The pilots and crews of the 8th Air Force were demonstrating unbelievable courage, facing flak and fighters every day, but the equation simply didn't balance. They were sacrificing themselves for marginally effective results. The forbidden thought, whispered only in the cramped, smoky briefing rooms, was that perhaps air superiority was not achieved by defending the bombers, but by annihilating the defenders entirely, regardless of the rules of engagement that shackled the escort pilots. This concept, deemed reckless and politically untenable by the rigid brass hat safe in headquarters, required a level of deep penetration and aggressive engagement that was, at that point, absolutely forbidden. The established doctrine of the 8th Air Force was clear, rigid, and ultimately deadly. Fighter escort pilots, whether flying the robust but range-limited P-47 Thunderbolt or the earlier, less effective P-38 Lightning, were mandated to stick within sight of the bomber stream. Their job was strictly defensive. Intercept the attacking Luftwaffe fighters only when they committed to a pass on the B-17s, and under no circumstances were they to stray far from their assigned quadrant. This policy stemmed from a deeply ingrained fear. The fear that if the escort was allowed to pursue German fighters aggressively, they might chase them away from the bomber formation, leaving an exploitable gap for subsequent waves of attackers. Moreover, the doctrine was born during a time when American intelligence vastly underestimated the logistical depth and speed of the German fighter recovery system. The thinking was, stay close, keep the formation tight, and protect your charges. The maximum endurance of the early fighter escorts played right into this conservatism. AP-47, even with external drop tanks, could barely manage the round trip to the border regions of Germany, meaning the deep target raids were always conducted unprotected over the most dangerous phase of the mission. The emotional toll this took on the fighter pilots was immense. Captain Jake Rattler Donovan, flying with the 56 Fighter Group, described the feeling as being tethered to a slow-moving target practice. He recalled watching multiple groups of Mi-109s form up miles away, circling, waiting for the precise moment the P-47s hit their fuel bingo point and were forced to turn west. It was an exercise in frustration. The enemy dictated the terms of the fight, knowing they had an infallible sanctuary just beyond the range of the escorts. The rules prohibited aggressive pursuit, even if that pursuit would eliminate the threat permanently. The pilots were forced to break off combat, often while holding an advantage, simply because their orders dictated proximity to the B-17s. This meant the German pilots they chased away would simply refuel and rearm, returning within hours, sometimes even minutes, supported by fresh waves from inland bases. The cycle was unsustainable, a bloody, predictable merry-go-round that ensured the Luftwaffe remained a potent threat well into 1944. The true solution lay in deep offensive penetration, disrupting the German system at its core, a move that was considered entirely too risky, too fuel-intensive, and fundamentally contrary to the strict defensive escort manual issued by the command staff. The turning point, the instrument that made the forbidden strategy even conceivable, was the arrival of the North American P-51 Mustang, specifically tailored for the European theater. Where the P-47 was a strong, rugged brawler, the P-51 was a long-distance sprinter, a predatory weapon of unprecedented range and speed, thanks largely to the genius of fitting it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Suddenly, the physical constraint that had plagued the 8th Air Force, fuel endurance, vanished. The Mustang, equipped with massive drop tanks, could fly alongside the B-17s all the way to Berlin and back, theoretically offering continuous protection. But physics had been solved, while doctrine remained fossilized. Even with the Mustang's capability, the high command insisted on the old, conservative escort tactics. The pilots were still ordered to maintain close proximity, often flying a weave pattern above and around the bombers, rigidly adhering to their sign boxes. This frustrated the aggressive young American fighter pilots to no end. They had a Greyhound trained for the hunt, but were still forced to walk it on a short leash. The sheer strategic potential of the Mustang was being wasted on defensive formation flying, where its speed and altitude advantage were severely limited by the cruising speed of the heavy bombers. The true strategic value of the Mustang wasn't just that it could go the distance. It was that it could operate independently at that distance. It allowed for the shift from defense to offense, but this required a commander willing to break the cardinal rule: do not abandon the bomber stream. Enter Colonel John Jingles Johnson, a fictionalized amalgam of the real aces like Don Blakesley and Hub Zemke, who arrived in England determined to prove that the only way to protect the sheep was to slaughter the wolves in their dens. Jingles knew the Luftwaffe's weakness was their finite pool of experienced pilots and their reliance on a structured ground control interception system. The forbidden strategy began to formulate in his mind. Use the Mustang's range to execute aggressive fighter sweeps ahead of the bombers, drawing the enemy into battle on American terms and chasing them until they ran out of sky or ran out of luck. This was not escort. This was pure aerial predation, and it defied everything the rulebook preached. The inherent conflict between the defensive mandate and the offensive capabilities of the P-51 bred immediate tension, culminating in the early, unauthorized experiments that would eventually become codified strategy. Colonel Johnson began observing the German interception tactics with obsessive detail. He noted that the Luftwaffe's fighter groups, Jägerschwadern, were holding back, pooling resources, and waiting for the moment they could achieve overwhelming local superiority, usually deep over Germany. They weren't wasting fuel chasing the P-47s in the English Channel. They were preserving their assets for the kill zone. Johnson's conclusion was revolutionary in its simplicity. If the Luftwaffe was saving their fighters for a specific point, the Americans needed to meet them at their home bases or at least far forward of the bomber stream, and force them into combat immediately upon scramble. This meant flying fighter sweeps that had no direct connection to the B-17's current location, a massive violation of the rules. On a frosty morning in December 1943, Johnson authorized a long-range weather reconnaissance mission, a thinly veiled cover for the first true strategic sweep. Taking 3 squadrons of P-51 he led them hundreds of miles ahead of a scheduled raid on Frankfurt. Their mission was not to look for the B-17's enemy. It was to find the enemy's base dash. They flew low, then high, utilizing the Mustang's speed to cover ground rapidly. The results were immediate and staggering. They caught an entire staffel of Mi-109s climbing out from a forward operating base near Münster, still forming up, heavy with fuel and vulnerable. The ensuing 20-minute engagement was a massacre, a glorious exhibition of the P-51's speed and maneuverability over the climbing German aircraft. Johnson's unit claimed 18 confirmed kills for 0 loss. The bombers attacking Frankfurt that day reported the lightest opposition they had seen in months. The key realization was that the Luftwaffe, expecting the Americans to be tied to the slow B-17s, had never developed robust anti-sweep protocols. They were caught flat-footed. The forbidden strategy was thus proven. The most effective way to protect the bomber was not by standing guard next to it, but by eliminating the threat before it could even enter the fight. Johnson returned to a firestorm. The commanding general was furious over the unauthorized deviation from the flight plan, threatening court-martial for abandoning the bombers, even though the bombers had sailed through relatively unscathed. The moral and tactical conflict had reached its flashpoint. Was adherence to protocol more important than saving hundreds of lives and crippling the enemy? The simmering resentment between the Escort pilots, who saw the strategic imperative clearly, and the high command, obsessed with preserving rigid control, boiled over in January 1944. The statistics from Colonel Johnson's unauthorized sweeps were now undeniable. Fighter groups that implemented aggressive, independent offensive maneuvers were achieving kill-loss ratios exponentially higher than those sticking strictly to the defensive weave. Yet, the official doctrine remained unchanged, reflecting the institutional inertia inherent in large military organizations. It demanded proximity, it demanded caution, and it forbade the deep, independent hunting that was proving so effective. Johnson, feeling the weight of the countless airmen being lost needlessly, made the ultimate gamble. Prior to the famous Big Week raids, Operation Argument, he delivered a now legendary briefing to his pilots. He threw the official Escort manual into the fireplace and declared, "From now on, the bombers are bait. Your job is not to babysit them. Your job is to find the enemy, destroy him, and destroy him deep inside his own backyard. If you see a lone 109 50 miles away, you hunt it down. If you see an airfield below, you hit hard. We are no longer escorts. We are hunters." This was the formal adoption of the forbidden strategy, the doctrine of pure air superiority through aggressive depletion, regardless of the direct risk to the bombers in the immediate vicinity. Johnson was essentially committing strategic insubordination, knowing a massive success was the only thing that could save him from ruin. The sheer audacity of the move, prioritizing the systemic collapse of the Luftwaffe over the immediate defense of a few B-17s, was breathtaking. He pushed his pilots to the very edge of their range, often skimming treetops, looking for telltale smoke trails or the dust clouds of scrambling fighters. The results during Big Week were catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. They were intercepted far from the bomber streams, engaged while forming up, and chased relentlessly down to the ground. Hundreds of German pilots were lost. But the question that haunted the officers making these decisions, the question that historians still debate, and the central moral pivot of this entire conflict remains: if you were in Colonel Johnson's position, facing a rigid, failing system, knowing that abandoning your direct orders could save countless lives down the line, but potentially expose the immediate bomber stream to greater risk, would you have chosen insubordination? Share your thoughts and personal opinions on this. Critical strategic gamble in the comments below. It is the defining moral choice of the entire air war, pitting short-term safety against long-term victory. The Luftwaffe's reaction to the sudden, aggressive change in American tactics was one of shock and rapid escalation. They had relied for months on the predictable behavior of the American escorts, calculating their interception points with precision knowing exactly where the P-47s would turn back. Now, the skies were infested with the sleek, silver P-51s, appearing where they shouldn't, chasing German aircraft to the ground, and worse, strafing active airfields with reckless abandon. This wasn't protection, it was systemic aerial murder. German fighter control went into momentary paralysis. They tried to counter the sweeps by deploying larger, more heavily armored formations of fighters like the Focke-Wulf FW-190, hoping to absorb the P-51's hits and overwhelm them. But the American aces, having been unleashed, were utilizing hit-and-run tactics, exploiting the P-51's superior high-altitude performance. The German pilots, many of them young and rushed into service due to attrition, quickly learned that once a Mustang locked onto their tail, survival was a matter of luck, not skill. The forbidden strategy wasn't just about shooting down planes. It was about destroying the Luftwaffe's infrastructure and, most importantly, their experienced pilot corps. Every time Colonel Johnson's men strafed an airfield, they weren't just destroying planes. They were destroying fuel, spare parts, and the ability of German ground crews to turn aircraft around quickly. The Luftwaffe, already suffering from severe fuel shortages and a decentralized training system, began to bleed out vital resources. The psychological impact was profound. German fighter pilots, once confident in their sanctuary, now knew the Americans could be anywhere, anytime, pursuing them down to the very moment of landing. This led to frantic, disorganized scrambles and pilots attempting risky, evasive maneuvers close to the ground, leading to accidents and non-combat losses. This strategic shift, from guarding the perimeter to invading the home base, forced the Luftwaffe to fight constantly on the defensive, depleting their irreplaceable assets faster than the Reich's industrial capacity could replace them. The Americans had effectively flipped the script. They had taken control of the timing, the location, and the intensity of the air battles over Germany, turning the defender into the constantly hunted prey. The results of the aggressive depletion strategy spoke for themselves, and by early 1944, the High Command, grudgingly or not, began to formalize Johnson's forbidden strategy. The success of Big Week cemented the idea. The 8th Air Force lost many bombers, but they achieved the critical goal of permanently crippling the Luftwaffe's effective fighting capacity. The tactic was formalized under the name Fighter Sweep, replacing the static close Escort doctrine. Escort groups were now given two simultaneous, often conflicting missions: target escort, the traditional close protection, and area sweep, the aggressive hunting far ahead of the bombers. Crucially, the area sweep groups were given tactical priority and the greatest range freedom. They were the spearhead, tasked with creating a vacuum of German air power through relentless pursuit. This tactical shift had profound implications for the German war machine. The sheer loss rate of experienced pilots became the most critical factor. Unlike the Americans, who could cycle combat-weary pilots back to the US for training assignments, the Germans had to rely on a dwindling pool. Losing an experienced Gruppkommandeur was an operational disaster that took months, if not years, to recover from. Furthermore, the relentless strafing of airfields forced the Germans to pull back their forward operating bases, increasing the time and fuel necessary for their fighters to reach the bomber streams. What was once a tactical luxury for the Luftwaffe, the ability to choose when and where to fight, was now a desperate scramble. The American pilots, now flying with a mandate to hunt, developed legendary confidence. Aces like Chuck Yeager and George Preddy rose to prominence during this period, specializing not just in the dogfight, but in the relentless, deep penetration missions designed to catch the enemy unawares. The P-51, coupled with the forbidden strategy, became the ultimate tool for achieving true air superiority, a state where the enemy's air force is no longer capable of mounting effective resistance, thus allowing the bombers to operate with near impunity. But the transition to aggressive hunting carried its own heavy emotional and ethical toll. This was not the glamorous, distant combat portrayed in newsreels. This was often low-altitude, high-speed murder. The aces who executed the forbidden strategy became predators, forced to adopt a ruthless mindset necessary to win. Captain Thomas T-Bone Rogers, a composite figure representing the aces of the 357th Fighter Group, spoke later of the internal conflict. When ordered to strafe airfields, the goal was not just to destroy parked aircraft, but to neutralize the threat of immediate takeoff. This meant shooting at anything that moved on the ground: fuel bozers, transport trucks, and sometimes unfortunate ground crew struggling to save equipment. T-Bone recalled one mission where he blasted a German hangar and saw two figures, clearly mechanics, frantically trying to push a Me-262 jet prototype back inside. His orders demanded their destruction. The line between combatant and civilian helper blurred constantly in the smoke of the airfields. The pilots were forced to rationalize this brutality as necessary to prevent future raids on the bomber crews. The sheer mental strain of constant deep penetration flying, knowing that any engine failure meant certain capture or death, was immense. The missions were often 6 or 7 hours long, requiring intense focus in a freezing high-altitude environment, followed by sudden, violent moments of close-quarters dogfighting where survival depended on split-second decisions. The forbidden strategy required a level of relentless aggression that drained the pilots both physically and spiritually. While the kill tallies soared and the bomber losses plummeted, the cost was measured not just in American fuel and German aluminum, but in the moral weight carried by the young men who were transformed from guardians into aerial executioners. They had won the air war, but the methods necessary to achieve that victory often left deep, invisible scars. By the summer of 1944, the relentless execution of the forbidden strategy had achieved something truly unprecedented: daylight air superiority over the entire occupied European mainland. The skies were empty. Where once the B-17s had fought through walls of flak and swarms of German interceptors, they were now often greeted only by sporadic ground fire. The German pilots who did ascend were often novices, desperate for fuel and flying aircraft cobbled together from multiple sources. Anecdotes from late 1944 illustrate the strategic victory far better than any statistics. One bomber crew reported flying a mission to Chemnitz, deep in Germany, without seeing a single enemy fighter for the entire 7-hour flight, a scenario unthinkable just 18 months prior. The fighter pilots themselves began to complain of target drought. Captain Rogers, who once had to fight for every inch of sky, lamented in a letter home that his primary mission now felt like a glorified weather check. The Luftwaffe's ability to mount organized resistance was broken. They attempted desperate, last-ditch measures, including the deployment of the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter, but even the speed of the jet could not overcome the Americans' crushing numerical superiority and their control of the high-altitude approaches. The P-51s, operating in groups, learned to wait for the Me-262s over their landing fields, where the jets were slow and vulnerable, finishing them off on final approach, another extension of the aggressive, forbidden strategy. The destruction of the German infrastructure, driven by the P-51's ability to roam and strike, meant that even technically superior aircraft could not be produced, fueled, or flown in meaningful numbers. The air war over Europe was won not by simply defending the B-17s, but by strategically dismantling the German Air Force piece by piece, pilot by pilot, deep inside the Reich, a strategy only possible because a few key figures were willing to defy convention and embrace the necessary risk of insubordination. The legacy of the forbidden strategy is immense, fundamentally altering modern air combat doctrine and proving once and for all that air superiority is an offensive achievement, not a defensive posture. It showed that the destruction of the enemy's fighting capability must take precedence over the immediate, static defense of friendly assets. The shift initiated by the P-51 aces, the aggressive, deep penetration, the relentless hunting sweeps, the willingness to strafe airfields and engage the enemy on their terms, saved thousands of bomber crews and drastically accelerated the end of the war in Europe by paving the way for D-Day. When the Allied ground forces finally landed in Normandy in June 1944, they did so under a canopy of American air dominance that was absolute, a reality that simply would not have existed had the 8th Air Force clung to its earlier conservative doctrines. It took immense courage, not just from the fighter pilots facing down the enemy, but from the commanders who risked their careers by challenging the rigid structure of military command. They realized that sometimes the only way to adhere to the true mission, winning the war, is by breaking the written rules. Their story is a powerful testament to the value of tactical innovation and aggressive execution in the face of overwhelming adversity. The P-51 Mustang became the symbol of this victory, the long-legged hunter that finally made the vast skies over Europe safe for the Flying Fortress. We owe a debt to the pilots who flew these critical missions, sacrificing their own personal safety to ensure the strategic defeat of the Luftwaffe. If this story of aerial aggression and tactical revolution touched your heart and broadened your understanding of the defining moments of the Second World War, please subscribe to WWII Lore, hit the notification bell, and join us next time as we dive deeper into the incredible stories of the aircraft and the heroes who achieved dominance in the hostile skies.